In the dying heart of the 13th century, when kingdoms rose and crumbled like waves against the shore, there stood a realm known as Eldamir, a land of vast meadows, storm-lashed coasts, and proud stone keeps that pierced the grey heavens. Its people were weary, worn by decades of war and famine, yet bound together by the legend of their ruler, King Alaric the Crimson. He was once the light of Eldamir, a warrior crowned by victory and adored by his people. But as years withered his triumphs, shadows began to stir in the corners of his hall. Whispers spoke of betrayal, of gold traded for blood, of alliances made in secret, and through the narrow streets of the capital, a single word carried on the wind: treachery. The story begins on a night when the moon was veiled by clouds. King Alaric stood alone upon the balcony of his citadel, watching the torches of his soldiers flicker in the courtyard below. He was older now, his beard silvered, his armor dulled by rust and memory. The rain struck his cloak like the tolling of an ancient bell. Beneath him, the city slept uneasily. The people of Eldamir prayed for peace. But peace, as the old saying went, never favored kings. Far beyond the walls, a rider approached from the east. His horse stumbled through the mud, breath steaming in the cold. When he reached the gate, the guards saw that his cloak was torn, his face pale with exhaustion. He carried a single message, sealed in red wax, marked with the sigil of the Northern Lords. Inside the great hall, Alaric broke the seal. His eyes moved across the parchment, his expression unreadable. The words were few, but they cut deeper than any sword, greater than "the North denies you. We march by dawn," and so began the unraveling of Eldamir. That night the king summoned his council, men who had once fought beside him, who now looked away when his gaze met theirs. At the table sat Sir Rowan, his oldest friend, and Lady Isolde, keeper of the royal archives and truth-teller to the throne. Alaric spoke first. They would turn their blades against their king. Rowan bowed his head. They do not see a king anymore, my lord. They see a man surrounded by ghosts. Isolde's voice was quiet, but unyielding. And ghosts, sire, have no armies. Alaric's hands trembled. The rain grew heavier against the stone. Then we prepare, he said at last. If the North would bring fire, we shall meet them in the storm. But even as he spoke, something in his eyes dimmed, as though a candle deep within him had flickered for the last time. For 7 nights, the rain did not cease. The fields turned to rivers, the villages to islands of despair. And when dawn finally broke, the horizon burned with banners, black and red, fluttering like wings of ravens. The war of the Northern Rebellion had begun. The morning of the rebellion came grey and cold. From the ramparts of Eldamir's fortress, one could see the enemy stretching across the plains like a dark tide. thousands marched beneath banners of the northern lords, their armor glinting faintly in the dim light. King Alaric stood at the highest tower, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. Once, he had led armies across these same fields. Now he defended what remained of his reign. His thoughts were not of glory, but of what would be left when the storm passed. Sir Rowan approached him quietly. "They've encamped beyond the river," he said. "By nightfall, they'll be within range of the walls." Alaric nodded. Then the walls must hold. Down below, soldiers moved like shadows through the courtyards, tightening ropes, raising barricades, and whispering prayers beneath their breath. There was fear in their eyes, though none dared to speak it aloud. They fought for a king who had already lost the favor of the gods. Lady Isolde walked among them, her cloak heavy with rain, her hands clutching a bundle of old manuscripts. She had long studied the prophecies of Eldamir, verses that spoke of the Crimson King and his fall. Yet as the thunder rolled in the distance, she could not bring herself to open them. Some truths, she thought, were better left unread. By the second night, the siege began. Arrows flew through the mist, the air filled with the cries of men and the sound of steel on stone. Fires broke out along the outer wall, casting the rain-soaked city in a trembling red light. Alaric rode among his men, his armor dented and scarred, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold the gates," he shouted. "Eldamir does not yield." They fought for hours. Every breach was sealed, every assault repelled. Yet for each enemy they felled, two more rose in his place. The northern lords were relentless, their hatred sharpened by years of broken oaths. When dawn came, the walls still stood, but the city beyond them was broken. The granaries burned, the wells poisoned, the streets littered with the dead. Alaric stood in the great hall once more, the same hall where he had once been crowned. Only a handful of his council remained. Rowan was wounded, his arm bound in a bloodied cloth. Isolde's voice was hoarse from shouting orders to fleeing citizens. "We cannot hold another day," Rowan said bitterly. "The walls will not stand a second assault." Alaric's face was pale. "Then we will fall as kings," he said. But even as he spoke, his mind drifted elsewhere, to the memory of his son, Prince Edric, who had vanished years ago beyond the sea. The boy had spoken once of building a new world, one free of crowns and chains. Alaric had laughed then, calling him a dreamer. Now, as Eldamir burned, he wondered if the dreamer had been right. That evening, the sky turned the color of ash. The final assault began. Siege towers rolled forward, and the gates shuddered beneath the weight of a battering ram. Arrows rained from the battlements, but the enemy pressed on. At last the gates gave way. The enemy poured through like floodwaters. Alaric fought among his men until his sword broke. Rowan fell beside him, pierced by a spear. The king's armor was heavy, his strength fading, but he would not retreat. He struck down every foe who came near, his crimson cloak torn and soaked dark. As the flames rose higher, Lady Isolde fled through the hidden tunnels beneath the castle, carrying with her a single relic, the royal seal of Eldamere. She did not look back. Above, in the burning hall, Alaric knelt upon the shattered stone floor. The crown had fallen from his head. His eyes lifted toward the open roof, where the storm raged on. And there, in his final breath, he whispered the words that would echo through the ages. Let them remember not the king I was, but the man I became. With that, the Crimson King fell, and Eldamere was no more. The winter had passed, and the banners of Averon once again fluttered across the hills. The scars of war remained on every stone and soul. Sir Aldric stood before the rebuilt walls, his armour dulled by age and grief. He had won the war, but at a cost far greater than he could bear. Queen Alara rode through the gates, no longer the captive of tyranny, but the ruler of a free realm. Her gaze met Aldric's, not as queen and knight, but as two survivors bound by sacrifice. The kingdom began to heal. Villages rose from ashes, songs returned to the taverns, and the children of Averon grew up hearing of the knight who defied darkness. Years later, when Aldric's sword was laid to rest in the Chapel of Kings, a single inscription was carved beneath it. Honor is not in victory, but in the courage to fight for what endures. And so the tale of Averon faded into legend, whispered by firelight, remembered by those who still believe that even in the darkest of ages, honor never dies. The ashes of the great hall had long since cooled, but the memory of Sir Aldric's final breath still lingered in the stones. The land lay quiet, scarred and waiting, and though the knight's voice was gone, his story was not yet over. Years passed, and from the silence rose a shadow of the past. His son, Edric Avelric, now grown and hardened by exile. He had wandered across distant kingdoms, his name buried, his purpose forged in solitude. But fate, cruel and patient, had not forgotten him. The boy who once fled in the night now returned a man, cloaked in the storm that heralded his bloodline. As rain swept over the valley of Cardenfell, Edric stood before the ruins of his father's keep. His gaze lingered on the stones blackened by betrayal, and he whispered softly, "Father, I have come home." The people of the realm had forgotten Sir Aldric's name, but Edric had carried it in silence, letting it sharpen him like steel. He had heard the tales, how Lord Garin, his father's friend turned executioner, ruled with an iron hand and a golden tongue, the same man who smiled as Aldric fell to the blade. But no lie lasts forever. As thunder rolled across the sky, Edric unsheathed the sword he had forged from fragments of his father's broken steel. The blade reborn, much like the man who now wielded it. He rode toward Thornwatch under the cover of night. The guards saw only a lone traveller. They did not know that vengeance rode beside him. When at last he entered Garen's hall, he spoke not with hatred, but calm. "You took my father's life," Edric said, his voice steady, cold as winter rain. "Now I come for his truth." The old lord sneered, too proud to tremble. "Truth died with him, boy." Edric's eyes narrowed. Then tonight it will rise again. Steel sang. The hall that had once echoed with laughter now thundered with the clash of destiny. Garin fought fiercely, but time had dulled his strength. Edric's blade found its mark swift and sure, not driven by wrath, but by justice long denied. As the usurper fell, Edric looked down upon him, the weight of 2 decades pressing upon his chest. "This is not vengeance," he said quietly. "It is remembrance." Outside, the wind shifted. Rain washed the blood from the stone floor. The storm that had haunted Cardenfell for years began to ease, and in that moment, Sir Aldrich's legacy, once silenced, breathed again through his son. The storm that had haunted Thornwatch was gone. The fires that once licked its towers had faded to embers, leaving behind a land reborn in silence. Edric Avelric stood atop the castle's rampart, the cold wind brushing against his face. Below him the valley stretched endlessly, the dawn breaking across fields still wet with rain. For the first time in years, the sun touched the stones of Cardenfell without shame. Lord Garin was dead. The usurper, who had taken everything from his family, now lay buried beneath the very earth he had stolen. Yet, as the people of Thornwatch whispered his name with fear and confusion, Edric felt no triumph, only the hollow echo of justice fulfilled too late. He had done what he swore to do, but vengeance, like winter, left nothing warm behind. The halls of Thornwatch stood empty now. Edric walked through them slowly, his boots echoing against the marble. His father's ring, once stolen, now rested on his hand, heavy with meaning. He stopped before the grand seat where Garin had ruled for decades, and placed the sword upon it. "This was never my throne," he murmured, "only his ghost's." Leora entered quietly, her cloak trailing over the stone. She had fought beside him through the night, and now her eyes carried both pride and sorrow. "It's over," she said softly. "Is it?" Edric replied. "The man is gone, but his shadow remains. The people still believe his lies. My father's name is still cursed in their songs." "Then change their songs," she said. "Not with blood, with truth." He looked at her, tired but resolute. "You think truth still matters in a land built on fear?" "It's all that ever mattered." Her words lingered in the air. Over the days that followed, Edric did not flee as most expected. Instead, he summoned the people, farmers, soldiers, servants, and stood before them not as a conqueror but as a son. He told them everything, of his father's honor, of the betrayal that damned him, of the years spent in exile waiting for a chance to set things right. Some doubted, others wept, but in the silence that followed, one thing became certain: truth had returned to Thornwatch. And so began the rebuilding of House Avelric, not of walls or crowns, but of memory. Edric reopened his father's halls, not for nobles or warriors, but for the lost and the forgotten, those broken by men like Garin. He trained young knights in the virtues his father died for: courage, mercy, and duty. He carried the same sword, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Years passed, the land healed slowly, the storms grew gentler. Travelers spoke of a lord who ruled not with fire, but with honor. And when the wind swept across the valley of Cardenfell, it carried not the cry of vengeance, but the whisper of peace. On the night of his final watch, Edric stood once more where his father had fallen. The stars were bright, the rain soft against the earth, he closed his eyes and said quietly, "Father, the story is done. The world remembers." The wind stirred, gentle and warm. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a knight's voice, proud at peace, answered in kind,